I never imagined that sleeping in a tent on the dirt I inherited would end with a dozen of the town's elite in federal handcuffs. But life has a funny way of escalating when you push a man who has nothing left to lose but his legacy. It started at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, the kind of deep, silent darkness you only get out here by the water, until my world exploded in blinding white light. "Sir, step out of the tent, hands where I can see them. We've got reports of a vagrant trespassing." I'm lying there, blinking against the glare, wrapped in a sleeping bag on land that has been in my bloodline since 1952, trying to process the absurdity of a deputy's hand resting on his holster while I'm just trying to camp. It turns out, some woman had spotted my tent from her balcony and dialed 911, absolutely convinced I was a dangerous squatter defiling her view of the lake. The irony, of course, is that my family owned this dirt before her subdivision was even a blueprint, before there was a paved road, and certainly before this woman decided she was the sheriff of Shadow Creek Lake. Even after the deputies ran my ID, apologized profusely, and shuffled back to their cruisers looking thoroughly embarrassed, she didn't stop. She stood on her manicured lawn, watching, seething. She had no idea who she was picking a fight with, and she definitely didn't know that by trying to evict me, she was handing me the shovel to dig her own grave. Let's rewind so you understand the stakes. 6 months ago, I was Elias Thorne, just another guy trying to decompress after 2 decades as a combat engineer in the Marines, drifting through civilian life until Grandpa Silas passed away. He left me his cabin. Now, when I say cabin, don't picture a vacation home. Picture a rough-hewn, cedar log fortress he built with his bare hands in the 50s, sitting on 5 acres of untouched wilderness. Walking through that front door was like stepping into a time capsule, the smell of old wood smoke and lake water hitting me like a physical blow, reminding me of summers spent learning how to bait a hook and, more importantly, how to stand your ground. Grandpa Silas was the kind of man who once stared down a commercial developer in the 80s with nothing but a shotgun and a scowl until they packed up their bulldozers. "Some fights choose you, Elias," he used to tell me, his voice gravelly and warm. "And when they do, you don't just fight, you finish it." I spent my first week just breathing, listening to the loons, feeling the crunch of pine needles under my boots. But then I noticed the encroaching infection. Since I'd last been here, a development called Whispering Pines Reserve had metastasized around my borders, a sprawling sea of cookie-cutter McMansions with lawns that looked like golf courses and souls that looked like nothing at all. My property was this rugged, wild peninsula jutting out into the water, a defiant middle finger to their beige conformity. That's when I met her, Victoria Sterling. Imagine the terrifying final boss of every HOA nightmare you've ever heard, wrapped in white linen and driving a pristine Range Rover. She rolled up my dirt driveway, stepped out with a clipboard that looked like a weapon, and introduced herself as the HOA president. "I'm here to discuss bringing this structure into compliance," she said, looking at Grandpa Silas's cabin like it was a pile of radioactive waste. I laughed, genuinely laughed, sipping my coffee. "Ma'am, this land isn't in your HOA. Never has been." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. It was just a baring of teeth. "Mr. Thorne, all lakefront properties fall under our covenants for the sake of property values and aesthetic cohesion." The way she said aesthetic made my skin crawl, a clear signal that this city transplant had decided to remake the wilderness in her own sterile image, and my rustic heritage was a smudge on her lens. That night, purely out of spite and nostalgia, I pitched my old military tent on the beach, wanting to feel the earth the way Grandpa Silas taught me, which led to the police confrontation. But the morning after the cops left, Victoria was back, and the mask was off. She handed me a notice for unauthorized temporary structures, and I realized this wasn't about rules. It was about dominance. A few days later, a certified letter arrived, fancy letterhead, legal jargon, demanding I attend an emergency community meeting to answer for my flagrant violations. I showed up to their community center in my work boots, walking into a room that smelled of floor wax and fear, packed with about 15 nervous neighbors. But standing next to Victoria was a man in an ill-fitting suit who looked like a shark in human skin. Arthur Sterling, her husband, and conveniently, the director of regional planning for the county. My military brain started connecting dots immediately. Public official, private interest, conflict of interest. Victoria fired up a PowerPoint, and it was a slideshow of my life. Photos of my dock, my truck, my tent, surveillance she'd been gathering for weeks. This blight, she announced, pointing to my home, drags down the value of every home in Whispering Pines. Then came the demand. Sign a retroactive compliance agreement, pay $2,000 in back fees, and start paying monthly dues. Arthur chimed in, using his government voice, threatening county enforcement if I didn't play ball. I stood up, walked to the front, and laid my surveyor's map and the original 1952 deed on their table. My family's land ends here, I said, tracing the line. And your jurisdiction starts way over there. You incorporated in 1995. You cannot retroactively claim a property you never owned. The room went dead silent. Victoria turned a shade of red that defied physics. Community standards supersede individual claims when the collective value is at risk, she spat. I turned to the room, looking at the neighbors. How many of you realized your HOA president is demanding money for land she has zero legal right to? And it makes me wonder, what other fees have you been paying that aren't actually legal? That was the match in the powder keg. Whispers erupted. An elderly woman, Mrs. Higgins, raised her hand, her voice trembling. We paid $1,500 for lake dredging last year. I haven't seen a single dredge boat. Victoria lost control. She screamed that the meeting was adjourned, storming out with Arthur trailing behind her like a whipped dog. Mrs. Higgins caught my arm as I left. Your grandfather warned us about people like her, she whispered. He said they'd never stop trying to take what isn't theirs. Driving home, I felt a grim satisfaction, but I also knew I had just kicked a hornet's nest. I thought I had won a skirmish, but I had actually started a war. The retaliation was swift and bureaucratic. Monday morning, a county code enforcement truck rumbled down my drive. The inspector, a sweaty, nervous guy, slapped me with citations for my septic, my electrical, my dock, everything that was grandfathered in. I need to see permits, he mumbled, refusing to look me in the eye. When I pressed him on why he was here now, after 70 years, he slipped up. Mrs. Sterling flagged this as a priority hazard. Bingo. Then came the petty torture. The HOA landscaping crew accidentally dumped a mountain of rotting grass clippings on my private beach. Leaf blowers started at 6 a.m. pointed at my windows. My mail stopped being delivered because of access issues. But they made a critical error. They assumed I was just a stubborn redneck in a cabin. They forgot that I spent 20 years in the Corps of Engineers analyzing infrastructure and finding weak points. If they wanted to attack my infrastructure, I was going to dismantle theirs. I started requesting environmental impact studies for Whispering Pines Reserve. I knew from experience that developers always cut corners on wetlands. And what I found in the public records wasn't just a violation, it was a smoking gun. They had built on protected wetlands, violating federal law. But then, Mrs. Higgins invited me for tea and told me the real horror story. The Millers, the DeVises, good families, she said, weeping. They were driven out. Fines, harassment, until they sold for half the value just to escape. I started digging into the sales records. Every forced sale was to a mysterious holding company, and every sale happened right after a sudden wave of code violations. This wasn't just a neighborhood spat. This was systematic ethnic and economic cleansing disguised as an HOA, a machine designed to grind families into dust so the rich could buy their land for pennies. The deeper I dug, the darker the water got, and I realized I wasn't dealing with a neighborhood bully. I was dealing with a cartel operating out of a suburban living room. I started documenting everything with the precision of a sniper waiting for a clear shot. Every fake violation, every interaction with the nervous county inspectors, every time Victoria Sterling's goons trespassed on my land. I needed patterns because patterns are what convict people. Mrs. Higgins became my intel officer on the inside. She organized quiet coffee mornings where other victims, families too terrified to speak up alone, spilled their guts. I met a young couple who had been bankrupted by legal fees fighting Victoria's made-up rules, eventually selling their dream home for a fraction of its worth to a company called Sterling Horizons Group. 2 weeks into my investigation, Victoria decided to drop the nuclear option. A certified letter arrived demanding $15,000 in unpaid dues spanning 20 years, threatening to place a lien on my grandfather's cabin within 10 days. But attached to it was a document that made my blood run cold. a photocopy of an HOA membership agreement, dated 1995, bearing Grandpa Silas's signature. I held the paper under my desk lamp, my hands shaking, not with fear, but with a cold, focused rage. I handled all of Grandpa Silas's paperwork for the last decade of his life. He would sooner have burned the forest down than sign an HOA agreement. But beyond that, I knew forensic analysis. The ink pressure was wrong. The signature was too shaky, a poor imitation of his bold script. And the paper, it smelled fresh, like toner that hadn't quite set. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was felony fraud. I hired a forensic accountant, a sharp-witted woman named Sarah, to tear apart the HOA's financials. What she found made Enron look like a lemonade stand. The HOA reserve fund was being siphoned off into consulting fees paid to shell companies in Florida. Companies registered to Victoria's relatives. They were stealing millions, laundering it through fake community projects like lake restoration. That never happened. But the harassment was escalating to a dangerous level. Victoria organized a safety patrol, essentially thugs with cameras stalking my property line. I found survey stakes driven into my beach, attempting to steal 20 feet of my shoreline. Then the online smear campaign started. Anonymous posts in local groups claimed I was an unstable veteran with PTSD, that I was hoarding weapons, that my cabin was a meth lab. They were trying to isolate me, to make me a pariah so no one would listen when I screamed about the corruption. Then Sarah called me at dawn, her voice tight with panic. "Elias, get down to my office." Now, when I got there, she had a timeline taped to her wall that looked like a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. "It's not just the money," she whispered. "It's the land. Look," she traced the sales. Every family forced out was sitting on a key parcel of land. And my property? It was the crown jewel. I was the bottleneck. Without Grandpa Silas's 5 acres, their plan for a massive expansion, a luxury resort called the Azure Coast, couldn't happen. They weren't just trying to get me to mow my lawn. They were trying to erase me to build condos. "They've killed for less," Sarah said, showing me the file on Mrs. Henderson, an elderly widow who died in a state-run facility months after Victoria's legal team seized her home. That was the moment I decided I wasn't just going to sue them. I was going to destroy them. I called my old friend from the service, Agent Miller, who was now working white-collar crimes for the FBI. When I laid out the evidence, the wire fraud, the mail fraud, the racketeering, the involvement of a county official, he nearly choked on his coffee. "This is a RICO case wrapped in a bow, Elias. But we need the kill shot. We need them to confess to the intent." So, I had to become an actor. For the next month, I played the role of the broken, defeated soldier. I let my yard get a little messy. I walked with a slump. I let word get back to Victoria that the legal fees were drowning me, that I was ready to break. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. Watching them torment Mrs. Higgins with fines, watching them terrorize a single mom down the street, and doing nothing because I had to wait for the trap to snap shut. Victoria, smelling blood in the water, went in for the kill. She slashed my truck tires in the driveway. Someone spray-painted "Get Out" on my cabin logs. It took every ounce of my discipline not to storm her house, but I knew the cameras I'd hidden in the trees were capturing it all for the feds. Finally, the invitation came. A private dinner at Le Jardin, the most expensive restaurant in the county. Victoria, Arthur, and the shadowy developer behind the scenes, Julian Cross. I wired up. Agent Miller taped the recording device to my chest, hidden under my flannel shirt. "Get them to brag," he told me. "Arrogance is their weakness." Walking into that restaurant felt like walking into a sniper's scope. Victoria was glowing, drinking wine, sitting next to Julian Cross, a man who looked like he measured human worth in square footage. "Elias," she purred, "we're so glad you're being reasonable. We have an offer. $200,000. Cash. You leave immediately." My land was worth $500,000 easily. That's not much," I stammered, looking at the floor. "My family has been here since the 50s. Sentimentality is expensive," Julian Cross said, his voice like cold oil. "We're building a $40 million resort. Your shack is in the way of progress." I looked at Victoria. "How many others?" I asked, my voice trembling fake fear. "How many families have you done this to?" She smiled, and it was the ugliest thing I'd ever seen. 12, she bragged, clinking her glass against Arthur's. "The Millers, the Hendersons, They all learned that resistance is futile against the county. Arthur here makes sure the permits get denied. I make sure the fines pile up, and eventually, everyone breaks. It's a perfect system. Arthur laughed, drunk on power and Merlot. The zoning office is a powerful tool if you know how to wield it, Elias. You can't fight the government when the government is sitting at this table. I felt the recorder burning against my chest. They had just admitted to conspiracy, extortion, and bribery. I need a few days, I whispered, to say goodbye to the cabin. Thursday, Victoria commanded. Thursday at noon, on the courthouse steps. We'll make a public signing ceremony, a symbol of the new community spirit. She wanted to parade my defeat. She wanted a trophy. I'll be there, I said, and I meant it. The morning of the signing, the air was crisp, the kind of autumn day Grandpa Silas loved, where the sky is a piercing, unforgiving blue. I packed a single manila folder. It didn't contain the deed transfer. It contained the death warrant for Victoria Sterling's empire. The smear campaign had reached a fever pitch overnight. Flyers were on every windshield in town warning of the dangerous veteran in their midst. But paradoxically, it backfired. The local VFW had issued a statement defending me. Neighbors who remembered my grandfather were quietly rallying. The town was holding its breath. I pulled up to the county courthouse. It was a circus. Victoria had actually invited the local news. She stood there in a white power suit, beaming next to Arthur and Julian Cross, framed by a banner that read, "A New Era for Shadow Creek." They looked like royalty surveying their subjects. What they didn't see were the plainclothes agents mingling with the cameramen. They didn't see the unmarked vans sealing off the side streets. They only saw me, the defeated soldier, walking up the steps with my head down. "Elias," Victoria called out for the cameras, her voice dripping with fake warmth. "So brave of you to embrace the future." Arthur stepped up to the microphone. "This transfer represents cooperation," he droned. "Removing old blight to make way for economic growth." I walked to the table. The contract waited there. A pen was offered. The cameras zoomed in. I looked at the pen, then I looked at the lens of the news camera, and I straightened my back. I dropped the broken veteran, act like a heavy coat. "Before I sign," I said, my voice projecting clear and hard across the plaza, "I have something to share." Victoria's smile faltered. "This isn't the time for speeches, Elias." "It's the perfect time," I said. I opened the folder. For 6 months, this woman, her husband, and this developer have operated a criminal enterprise that has stolen $2 million and destroyed 12 families. "Cut the feed," Arthur shouted, lunging forward, but he stopped when he saw the documents I held up. "I have financial records tracing laundered money to shell companies in Florida," I continued, staring right into the camera. "I have forensic proof of forged deeds. And I have recordings." I pulled out a small speaker I'd brought, though I didn't need it. The panic on their faces was enough. 3 nights ago, Arthur Sterling admitted to using his public office to bankrupt citizens. Victoria Sterling bragged about targeting the elderly. "He's crazy," Victoria shrieked, looking for an exit, her composure shattering. "He's PTSD. He's unstable." "No, Victoria," I said calmly. "I'm just thorough." Agent Miller stepped out from the crowd, his badge flashing in the sun. "FBI." Nobody moved. The scene descended into beautiful chaos. Uniformed officers swarmed the steps. Arthur tried to run back into the courthouse, but was tackled by a marshal. Julian Cross dropped his phone, hands in the air. But the image that will stay with me forever is Victoria. As the cuffs clicked around her wrists, she looked at me with a mixture of hatred and total disbelief. "You can't do this," she hissed as they walked her past me. "Do you know who I am?" I leaned in, just close enough for her to hear. "Yeah, you're the trespasser." The fallout was biblical. Victoria and Arthur took plea deals to avoid a jury trial, 8 years and 6 years respectively. Julian's development company was fined into oblivion. The EPA revoked every permit, and his assets were seized to pay restitution. 6 months later, the atmosphere at Shadow Creek is different. The air feels lighter. We used the settlement money, nearly $3 million, to help the displaced families buy back their homes. Mrs. Higgins is back on her porch. The wetlands are being restored. We turned the HOA into a voluntary neighborhood association, one that actually throws block parties instead of handing out fines. I set up a scholarship in Grandpa Silas's name for local kids studying environmental science. Sometimes, late at night, I sit on the end of my dock. I think about the cost of all this. The stress, the anger, the year of my life spent fighting a hydra. Was it worth it? There's a dangerous idea out there that you should keep the peace, that you should let the little injustices slide, because fighting back is too hard. But peace purchased with submission isn't peace. It's just a slow defeat. I look out at the water, reflecting the moonlight, completely free of condos and construction cranes, and I know the answer. We have a moral obligation to be dangerous to corrupt people. Justice isn't something the government gives you. It's something you have to force into existence, sometimes with a stack of evidence and a wiretap to your chest. Grandpa Silas was right. Some fights choose you, and if you run from them, you lose a piece of your soul. But if you stand, you might just save a whole village. And me? I'm just happy to be camping again.